Hi there, welcome to Stock Club, a podcast brought to you by My Wall Street. I'm James, and joining me on today's episode are Rory and Anne-Marie from the My Wall Street analyst team. Today, we're talking about Doordash and the future of the food delivery services, why Ford was our best performing stock in 2021, and the two stocks that we'd pick if we were starting a brand new portfolio this year. So here we are, guys, the first podcast of 2022. How were your breaks? Anne-Marie, you were back in the US. Did you have a nice time?
Yeah, I did have a nice time. It was unusually warm in Colorado, which was good, but basically all of my friends had COVID, so I couldn't hang out with anyone. I was just at home with my parents.
You can pretty much copy-paste that story for everybody. I'm actually curious, and maybe our listeners are probably wondering, does America shut down for 2 weeks like we do here in Ireland? Like, we haven't had it, we skipped the podcast. My Wall Street office is pretty much just closed down from Christmas Eve until a few days after New Year's. Does that happen in America too, or is that kind of a more European thing?
No, like most of my friends, like the day after Christmas were working, and a lot of people like to go shopping immediately, like the day after Christmas, like to go to the mall to get the after Christmas
that is
sale.
a thing here, in fairness, is the St. Stephen's Day sales, which it's kind of like our Black Friday. But the whole country just kind of shuts down for 2 weeks. How was your Christmas, Rory?
I got COVID.
Did you ask for COVID for Christmas?
Yeah. I think I got COVID in the week where every other person I know got COVID. There was at one point, there's more people have it than don't have it.
Yeah.
So I spent Christmas mostly in isolation, except for me and my partner. But yeah,
it's tough out there, isn't it? It kind of feels like everything. I've somehow managed to evade COVID this far, and I know I'm putting this on public record, so I'm probably jinxing myself. But it just feels like everything's exploding around you, and you're just kind of somehow walking through unscathed, just waiting to be hit. But it's a new year, hopefully a better year. We said that last year for 2021. 2021 was supposed to be our year, but 2022 is going to be our year, I feel it. Any New Year's resolutions, guys, that you have on the cards? Rory, you completed your New Year's resolution last year.
I did. I completed for the first time ever. I completed a New Year's resolution. I watched 52 documentaries, so one a week.
What was the best? What was the worst?
I won't say what the worst was, because none of them were bad. I pretty much enjoyed all of them and learned something from all of them. I mean, some of the really good ones was Jodorowsky's Dune was really good. Anyone who's interested in Dune, the novel, there was a kind of quite out there avant-garde Chilean director who tried to make it back in the 70s, and this was a documentary about all the things he was trying to do with it, like Mick Jagger was involved and Pink Floyd were involved. Salvatore Dali was playing a part at one point.
All fairly level-rounded individuals.
It was considered the most ambitious film project ever conceived. So that was a really good one. What else? I really liked one called Bill Cunningham, New York, about the kind of street photographer who's working for the New York Times over the years. There's loads of really good ones. Funnily enough, very few about kind of business or investing or any of that. I kind of seen most of those ones already.
Yeah, you know it all. Anne-Marie, what about you? Any resolutions?
No, I have no resolutions. I actually flew back to Ireland on New Year's Eve, flew through the night, and so I just missed out on New Year's altogether. I'm still in 2021, I think.
Yeah. That's fair. Well, in fairness, you said you had no resolutions very resolutely, so maybe that's something. Let's move on then. And lots have happened over the week we kind of missed the podcast. And I think one of the biggest ones is, of course, Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. Theranos? No, Teranos. Sorry.
Theranos. What is wrong with you?
Start the year again. Theranos. So, for long-time listeners of this podcast, they might remember that a few years ago we spoke very, very frequently about Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, almost as much as we talk about Elon Musk right now. But for anyone who doesn't know the story, Theranos was founded and led by the turtleneck-clad leader Holmes, who claimed that she had developed these self-service machines that could run an array of diagnostic tests on just a single drop of blood. Apparently, the idea came from her inherent fear of needles and getting blood taken. I'm in no way medically minded, but apparently this technology was hailed as modern medical miracle, and the company drew in an array of impressive names as early investors, including the former Secretary of Defense James Mattis and the former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, as well as deals with the likes of Walgreens. It was a really, really big deal. She was hailed as the new Steve Jobs, but of course the technology soon turned out to be a complete and utter scam, thanks in no small part to investigative work by the Wall Street Journal, and the $9 billion company quickly started falling apart. Just this week, Holmes was found guilty of 4 counts of defrauding investors. It looks like she might be in for a lengthy jail sentence. Rory, considering this company never actually managed to get as far as going public, why do we talk about it so much? Why is it an important one for retail investors to know about?
Before I answer that, can you just say the founder of Apple's name again there?
Steve Jobs? Jobs?
We've broken
Rory, if
James.
you want to host the podcast, you can host the
Broken
podcast, okay?
James. Oh, God.
How do you say it?
Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs, Jobs. I have this problem with data and data as well. I never know which to say, and I always panic when I come up to the word. Anyway,
Except
back to
both
the question.
data and data are acceptable pronunciations. Who's calling them Jobs? Who's like, I'm in the market for a new Job?
I was watching too much Arrested Development.
Yeah,
over
that's what
Christmas.
I said.
Right, back to the question. We can't start off the first podcast of this year this chaotically.
Okay, go on.
Rory, why is it so important for retail investors to follow Theranos?
Even though it's not a public company, I suppose there's a lot more to investing than simply following public companies. Public companies are really just like a mechanism through which we can invest. But in general, investing is kind of more about kind of thinking about the world and understanding how the dots connect. And I think, you mentioned that book, Bad Blood. I mean, Bad Blood is, in my mind, one of the real great documents out there that really dives into, I suppose, the underbelly of Silicon Valley and startup culture and provides so many lessons, some of which could be pretty kind of uncomfortable for investors. Just the idea that a company is maybe not telling you the truth can sometimes things that retail investors may struggle with. And there's a wide range of untruths, let's say, that managers can tell, from maybe being a little bit more dovish than they should be when it comes to guidance, for example, or just straight up falsifying numbers. Now, that's rather rare when it comes to large public companies, particularly in developed markets in the US, but it still does happen. And there's people out there who dedicate their lives to unearthing those lies and publishing short reports, etc. But that's a really hard thing for a retail investor, who's maybe dedicating kind of a few hours a month to keeping his portfolio in check. Then there's also this kind of argument from authority bias, which I think we also come to. How many times have you heard about some new company that perhaps has a big name in the world of business attached to it? You hear something like, oh, well, Sergey Brin's involved in it, or Jeff Bezos or Mark Cuban has invested in this. And that's kind of like an endorsement that checks all the boxes. We just kind of assume that these people that we've heard of have invested, and that's the box is ticked and everything's above board. But time and time again, we see that that's not the case. And as you said, there was a lot of very prominent names attached to this. 2 former secretaries of state, 2 former senators, a former CEO of Wells Fargo, a former director of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. These were all on Theranos' board.
Wow.
And it was actually George Shultz's grandson who was one of the main whistleblowers and tried to convince his grandfather that the whole thing was a fraud. He was working in Theranos and he was just ignored. So the board knew that there was questions about this, and none of them are going to face consequences despite that serious failure of duty. Kind of big business names, Larry Ellison of Oracle, Rupert Murdoch, the Walton family of Walmart, these were all major investors. Ellison was actually kind of a mentor to Holmes, although I'm sure he would deny that at this point. But the Davos Family Fund, for example, this came out in the trial. They invested over 100 million in Theranos and admitted that they didn't actually ask all the questions that they wanted to because they were worried that if they pried too much, they would be uninvited from participating in the race. Now, I think a lot of people would be amazed at that. 100 million quid on the table and you're kind of, you're antsy about asking questions, but that's the reality.
Yeah.
Something very exciting comes around and everyone's trying to get in on the ground floor. People make rash decisions. There's a real FOMO that can override people's usual sense of caution. And we see this at every level of investing, whether it's in these huge investing rounds or down to, individual investors buying into things like IPOs or new technologies they don't understand. And I think, finally, if you read the book, I believe kind of the first tip off that Carrie got, if I'm remembering correctly, was from someone who was trained in hematology, who basically told them that they believed what Theranos was claiming was impossible on a technical level. That's a kind of knowledge base only a very small percentage of the population has. And that's why I think it's always advisable to just really avoid these kinds of businesses. I know it sounds exciting, this new technology that's going to change the world, but you can't really understand it. With a lot of companies, you can't obviously get really into the bones of it, but you can understand the basic mechanics of how the business works. Whereas with these kind of biotechs, it's very difficult for an individual investor to get their head around it.
Yeah, and does it come back to kind of that circle of competence thing? Theranos was a private company when it went bust, but there was other high-profile companies that did eventually make it to market, the likes of WeWork eventually, but Lordstown Motors and Nikola were both recent companies that were on the public markets and were accused of and in some cases proven of kind of scamming investors. How, as retail investors, do we perform enough due diligence to avoid these companies? Do we just invest in companies that we really can understand the product, what they're doing, or how do we kind of guard ourselves against that?
I mean, like there's no there's no like, you know, amount of due diligence that is the right amount of due diligence. You know, you can't possibly expect to know everything about a business, even in like a very small business, let's say like ours. There's so much, you know, to know. You couldn't possibly know everything. So how you're going to understand these billion-dollar businesses and understand every kind of nook and cranny of them, it's just impossible. And I mean, what you really need to do is try and, you know, get a sense of the founders. Like, you know, it's funny how many people invest in businesses without even knowing the name of the CEOs or the founders or who's running the show. You know, listening to them on things like podcasts and interviews is actually quite, or even earnings calls is quite a good start. And then, yeah, trying to get just a fundamental understanding of the business and does it make sense? You're still massive potential to be caught out. You know, con artists are con artists for a reason. They're good at conning people, and that's why obviously you need to kind of diversify and make sure that you're not tied to one single business, because it will happen at some point. If you're investing for your entire life, at one point you will get caught up with a company that turns out to have been fraudulent or done something that they shouldn't have, and it's going to hurt. But that's why we diversify.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned that John Carreyrou book, Bad Blood, which was fantastic and kind of was part of the unraveling of the company. But I think what came across in that quite a lot was that Elizabeth Holmes, she wasn't exactly a Bond villain either. I think she set out to do something which was, you know, quite admirable, and, you know, things kind of fell apart and, you know, the technology didn't work as planned. But what I really got the sense of was that faking it until you make it. And I know that phrase is used quite a lot, and, you know, we see it quite a lot in you know, Silicon Valley wider, these companies with this technology, and they kind of, you know, sandbag the numbers a little bit and say it's doing a little bit better than it does, and say it does more than it does in order to get that investment and get to the company to where it needs to be, and when it can ultimately fill the promise. And Marie, what's your perception on that? Where do you think that line between, you know, faking it until you make it and outright fraud can we define the line in the sand there between those two things?
I mean, it's really difficult because I think like you have that part of your brain that's kind of a child that really wants to believe in that like pragmatic, forward-thinking, visionary CEO. And sometimes like that's good when it comes to long-term investing, because you could have a CEO that might have like a 30 or 40-year plan, and you're like, where he or she is laying the seeds now and it'll all pay off and we should invest now. But I guess like you still have to have the due diligence to go in and have a look at the company themselves. Like I think we sometimes have that problem with Elon Musk. Like Elon Musk talks about SpaceX and how we're going to Mars, and then like just last month, there was a leak from inside SpaceX that apparently they're teetering on bankruptcy because they can't launch enough rockets to ensure that, you know, they can sign enough clients to make their space haulage business pay off. And like if space haulage is step one to get to Mars, if all you're focusing on is Mars, you're going to get caught out in some way. I think it's very difficult. Like it's almost like Willy Wonka. Like if all you knew about Willy Wonka before you went in the factory was he made all these like wonderful magical treats, you'd be like, this guy is great, we should be investing in Willy Wonka. And then you got into the factory and there's a boy who almost drowns in a river and there's like an entire enslaved society and the golden geese are being kept in like a factory farm. You'd be like, this is a terrible investment. But like you wouldn't know until you got in there, you know? So I guess it's that thing of like, don't allow yourself to be blinded by the leader. Like you can love the leader and you could admire them, but make sure that it's backed up in some way in terms of the details within the company itself.
What a brilliant.
That was a fantastic analogy. When you started off, I was like, how's she going to pull this back? And then you mentioned the child murders and things like that, and was like, yeah, papering over in that. Yeah, but like even with that idea of a strong founding CEO, like you know, the likes of Elon Musk or perhaps Willy Wonka, is there a case, you know, we always look for a strong founding CEO in a company, but is there a case that sometimes a CEO who founded a company can be too personally invested in success and will kind of stop at nothing, even lying to people just to get it where they believe it needs to go?
I mean, yeah, I guess so. But that's like, oh, that's such a personality thing, I guess. Like,
yeah.
How many, you know, you're always going to come across, like, there's bound to be, if you're the CEO of a company, there's probably going to be a couple sociopaths who slip through the cracks who end up being CEOs. Do you know what I mean? And they're probably great at lying and defrauding investors and that sort of thing. It's just like a risk.
It's the highest percentage of sociopaths in the world are CEOs, aren't they?
Yeah.
Really?
I mean,
and dentists, yeah.
And dentists.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not just making this up. This
thing?
was like, was it in John Ronson's psychopath test? I think they did a survey of like your most likely occupation to be a sociopath, and CEOs are like way at the top.
Maybe that's a good test. Like, maybe you should pick CEOs of companies the way that you pick a dentist. Like, you want someone who knows what they're doing, but doesn't it doesn't flaunt it. You know, you don't want someone like trying to like give you a filling who's like super, arrogant and into their own work. You want them to be good, but not like too egotistical.
You were nailing it today. I mean, the thing with Holmes certainly was that, I suppose the whole point of this trial was like, when did the intention to be fraudulent begin?
Yeah.
That's really one of the kind of the contentions with the trial. And I think if you were to give her the benefit of the doubt, and I think in Bad Blood, Carew does kind of end up there. She didn't start out with the intent of committing fraud, but rather did fully believe that they would end up solving this problem.
Yeah.
And obviously, in order to raise funds, all founders go out and they try and give the rosiest picture they can. And, when things don't go the way you said they were going to go, perhaps there's a bit of equivocation to start, a bit of lying by omission. And we know how that can start snowballing, or you're creating new falsehoods to cover up previous ones. And it happens all the time in business, pretty endemic in the tech sector, actually, where, you launch minimally viable products that don't do what you said they would do in the hope that you get it right further down the road. And of course, Oracle were pretty famous for this kind of behavior. And Larry Ellison was a mentor to Holmes. So, she didn't lick it off a stone, as my mother would say.
And with that, we might move on to the next story. So this is actually another very interesting story that came across our desk. And Anne-Marie, this is one you kind of threw into our Slack channel earlier in the week. So Doordash is making all of its employees, everyone from its regular riders to its engineers to its exec team and even its CEO Tony Zhu, complete deliveries for the service at least once a month. Now, this isn't exactly a new program. It's part of something called WeDash that was started back in 2013 but had been paused at the start of the pandemic for obvious reasons. However, the restarting this program recently has caused a lot of consternation amongst employees of the company, especially those that seem to have joined only in the last year or two when the program wasn't running. According to a USA Today report, disgruntled employees are taking to anonymous social media platforms like Blind to voice their annoyance, with one comment reading, "I didn't sign up for this. There was nothing in the letter job description about this." Anne-Marie, as you brought this story to us, I'd like you to kind of tell us what's going on with this. Why would a $45 billion company run a program when so many people are so angry about it?
I guess it kind of serves two purposes. Number one is it's probably a legitimate attempt to ensure that every member of the company understand its foundational product from both sides, but being a consumer and being a dasher. Because DoorDash, as one of these gig economy companies, is entirely reliant upon dashers to make their product run. And there are definitely far more dashers by a high multiple than of other types of employees that'll ever be employed by the company. Like they're essential, and there's a lot of them. And I believe, and I think probably CEO Tony Xu believes, that in order to maintain DoorDash's growth and to build a superior product, a key part of that is ensuring that gig workers are happy. So how better do you do that than by ensuring that the engineers that build the app's functionality or the managers that make the long-term plans are also dashers, or at least they're a dasher once a month. I think it's probably beneficial for their product, particularly because the gig economy right now is very competitive. It's probably very difficult to bring in new workers because there's Uber Eats, then there's just driving for Uber, there's Lyft, there's so many different things that you could be doing. So they probably want to make sure that that end of the product is as successful as it can be. It probably also is a bit of a PR move. Gig-reliant companies have gotten a lot of flack recently for poor working conditions, a lack of pandemic support, poor benefits, and low pay. This is probably somewhat of a way to be like, oh, but everyone in the company understands. We all understand to some degree what this job is like, and we're going to try and make it as better as possible within the capacity of our actual jobs. How much this actually will benefit the normal dashers, I don't know. But
Yeah, it's similar to something here at My Wall Street. We encourage, obviously, everyone at My Wall Street are investors themselves, and even if you join the company and you're not an investor at that point, you're given a stipend to invest, and I think that's important. But I suppose with DoorDash specifically, there's been so much discussion in recent years about the inequalities in the food delivery industry, as you mentioned, and especially that tension between the so-called white-collar workers like engineers and execs and people like that, and then the workers that actually have to deliver the goods, the so-called dashes in this case. This program is obviously a way to combat this and help people understand it, but do you think maybe for broader society and for us commentators looking in, it's just highlighted these tensions more, especially with kind of the wider pressures in the labour market in the US at the moment?
Yeah, definitely. I think like it will maybe make their management more sympathetic to like poor working conditions or understanding what it's actually like when you try to deliver to somebody's house and they yell at you, or I think they'll be exposed to that end of things. But I would argue that the real issue with gig workers and the gig economy in general is pay and benefits and how these workers are classified. And if you are a software engineer and you're making $400,000 a year and you have to do one Doordash a month, you are not experiencing the economic instability that the vast majority of gig economy workers experience when they have this type of job. And so I'd say the main weakness of being a DoorDasher is not explored when you only have to do it once a month as part of your contract.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree. And like then just I suppose with the gig economy and specifically that food delivery aspect of it as well, it's something we haven't talked about for in quite a while. And Roy, I'd be interested to get your opinion here. Is to my knowledge, I don't think there's any companies in the My Wall Street shortlist that are kind of in that area. Is it an industry or a sub-industry we've looked at recently? Is it something we think maybe becoming more sustainable with bigger players kind of taking over more market space, or is it still something we kind of avoid?
Yeah, I've never personally been a fan of that the model. Yeah, like I said, don't have Uber or Lyft because I think an awful lot of those businesses it's kind of this, I don't want to say kind of deal with the devil essentially. It's
okay,
like,
explain.
you kind of, well, what they're selling is this kind of unsustainable life, where every person has their own private driver who comes and picks them up whenever they want and drives them wherever they want to go, and you can do this for practically nothing. There's no, and in a situation like that, someone is getting screwed, for the word, and a lot of the time it is the drivers. In the restaurant model, you've got another player involved, which is the restaurants themselves. So you've got the drivers and the restaurants and the end consumer, and so there's this other kind of tension between those three parties. The consumer doesn't want to pay a lot, the driver obviously wants to make some money to live on, and the restaurant has razor thin margins. And what I find with particularly, I mean, DoorDash is, I think, probably the best run of those businesses. But essentially what they're doing is they're kind of subsidizing the delivery of the major chains like McDonald's and KFC and Chick-fil-A from money out of the pockets of kind of independent restaurants, because McDonald's isn't paying them the same cut as the smaller businesses are. And so it's just kind of, I mean, we say unsustainable, we talk about like what's happening with the workers, but just the general idea of it just ends in a really bad place for me, which is that your only options are McDonald's or Olive Garden for the rest of your life. And I don't like that. I don't want to live in a world that's like that. So yeah, they're not ever really on my radar. I kind of hope they don't succeed, so I wouldn't recommend them as an investment.
Well, yeah, there you go. We did our predictions in the last episode about the year ahead, but I'd be curious to hear where do both of you think this kind of food delivery industry is going to go, if you do think it's going to go anywhere? Like customers, and I would tentatively include all of us in that. There's Deliveroo here in Ireland, and we get, I get my burgers and stuff delivered to the house. It's useful for customers. It obviously squeezes people in other parts of the chain, but it's not going away. But how is it going to evolve?
I mean, I hope there's regulation. There's regulation being brought in particular cities in the US where they're limiting the amount that they can take as a cut. A lot of them are trying to get around that by adding on kind of top level fees like marketing fees, and then what happens then is just the table stakes change. So if you aren't paying the marketing fees, you're never going to get found. So you have to pay the marketing fees. So that's how they kind of get around that kind of legislation. And there's I don't know where it ends, because it's clearly something that people want. It's a convenience that people are willing to pay a little bit for, and if someone came in and said, you know what, like to make this sustainable, we're going to take a much smaller cut, or we're going to charge the customers more for it, then someone else would just come in and undercut them. And so there's this kind of vicious cycle of, well, it's a kind of race to zero that's going to end with someone that, like I said, is going to be out of pocket for this, and it's typically not going to be the consumer. It's typically going to be the service provider.
Absolutely. So I can kind of assume we're not going to see DoorDash or the likes in the My Wall Street shortlist anytime soon. Let's move on then and just touch on some of the things going on around My Wall Street at the moment. So it's the start of a new year. We've loads of great stuff coming up in the My Wall Street app. We've got our January Stock of the Month pick, which was launched just a couple of days ago. We've got our exclusive Stock of the Month podcast coming on Monday, which me and Anne-Marie recorded earlier. We've a brand new stock coming in the next few weeks as well. We're also getting ready to kick off off with the next Fundamentals of Stock Picking course as part of the My Wall Street Academy. In this, you can join our chief investor Emmett Savage in the digital classroom as he brings you through his strategy for finding market-beating stocks. He shows you everything from the places he finds initial stock ideas to the 10-point checklist he uses to assess if a stock is a good investment or not. This course is ideal for anyone that has become a better investor on their list of New Year's resolutions. Now, Anne-Marie, there's a resolution for you. You'll also get a chance within the course to pitch your own stock pitch to Emmett and get your feedback on your skills as a stock picker. The next course is kicking off next Wednesday, January 12th, and it's limited to just 50 students. There's still a couple of spots left, so if you're interested in seeing what the course is about, you can go to My Wall Street Academy. The link is in the notes for today's show. You can just Google My Wall Street Academy and you can preview the first module of the course for free by just creating an account. Plus, listeners to this podcast can get a special $100 discount by using the code Stock Club Pod. That's all one word, Stock Club Pod, at the checkout page. Mailbag. And for this week's mailbag, we're talking about something that I can safely say I did not think we would be talking about this time 12 months ago, which is Ford being a fantastic investment. So the 100-year-old company was one of the top performing stocks in S&P 500 for 2021, returning just shy of 140%. It was also one of the best performing stocks in My Wall Street's own shortlist too, which is perhaps explained by the bad year tech stocks had and growth stocks, but also is very impressive for a company like Ford. Anne-Marie, you've talked about Ford quite a lot on this podcast. Do you think, 2021 was a fair assessment of Ford as a company and where it is now, or do you think it was buoyed by different forces?
I mean, it is the backdrop of the market being quite unkind to growth stocks. But then on top of that, I think the wide opinion of Ford at the beginning of the year was very negative. Like the stock was very, very low when COVID kind of hit. They kind of fell into the toilet a bit. So there kind of was nowhere to go but up. But on top of that, I actually do think Ford had a pretty nice little year. Their move towards electric vehicles is very smart. It's very well executed. They own 12% of Rivian, which is like a really nice little pot of cash they have if they need it. Their EV production is expected to reach 600,000 vehicles by 2023, which means they can already produce half the vehicles that Tesla can currently produce. And they've had to close pre-orders for the Ford F-150 Lightning and the Mach-E due to excessive demand, which are great things to see from Ford. That's probably the most excited anyone has ever been about a Ford vehicle. And in terms of being an investment, it has a market cap of $80 billion. Tesla has a market cap of over $1 trillion. So if the race is to who can produce the greatest number of EVs, Ford is currently in second place and is 1/10 of the cost of Tesla. So yeah, I know it was unexpected, but they've made a couple really nice moves this year. So I mean, I'm not mad at them. They can have this year.
And how much do you think this is down to the new CEO, Jim Farley? He came in, I think it was kind of about a year and a half, maybe a little bit less ago, and I think he kind of was the one who kind of led this new vision of Ford as an EV maker.
I think it is the EV push. That is undeniable. There's so much excitement in the market for electric vehicles. And I think it's kind of nice. I think they're kind of the grounding force in the EV market. We've talked about this previously in terms of issues in terms of mass manufacturing of vehicles, how razor thin margins are when it comes to cars. And so having an experience player like Ford coming in and producing cars that are already popular and just electrifying them, I think is a very nice, stable play for the EV market. Yeah, and Ford needed change. It was quite a stagnant stock for a number of years. So it's exciting to see.
What do you think, Rory? Might we see Ford as stock of the month in the coming months?
I mean, Marie would be the writer of it. She knows way more about it than I do. Ford do have, by the way, 3 times the revenue of Tesla as well. So I mean, whatever about being in second place, I'm waiting for someone to say Ford's not a car company. It starts getting to the really ridiculous multiples.
Yeah, but Ford don't have a car that's orbiting the Earth. So come on, get it together, guys.
Yes.
Yeah, no, definitely an interesting one though. I think it was one of the nicer, more interesting stories I definitely took from last year. And it's always good to kind of be reminded of those companies like that. Right, guys, we're nearly finished today's podcast, so let's move on to the elevator pitch to finish out today's show. So as I've probably mentioned about 10 times in this podcast, it's January, and this time of the year many people make the New Year's resolutions, including getting started in the world of investing. So assuming that there'll be a lot of people listening to this podcast today who are thinking about getting into investing or starting their portfolio, I asked both of you guys to pitch me the one stock you'd start off a brand new portfolio with today. So if you were starting out in the world of investing, clear-eyed and clear-skinned and younger than you are now, what stock would you be adding to your portfolio first? Rory, I'll go to you first.
I'll go with Amazon. It's it's a boring answer, but if I was starting a portfolio tomorrow, it would be the first stock I buy. I mean, I always think it is good to for your first stock to be, well, maybe not necessarily your first stock. Your first stock can be, anything you want it to be. I suppose anything that kind of inspires you. But starting a portfolio, it's always good to kind of grab a big enough business that you kind of understand well, and that you know isn't gonna go disappear tomorrow. If Amazon disappears tomorrow, there'll be bigger concerns in your portfolio. It's a brilliantly run business. As I've heard people, there's been suggestions that Amazon Web Services by itself is worth $1.5 trillion. So an investment in Amazon today, you're getting the e-commerce business for free. So
yeah. Absolutely. I
always a good
suppose as a first stock pick, yeah, you're dipping your toe into so many different industries and businesses. It's definitely a good one. It's nearly diversification in itself. Anne-Marie, what about you?
Hearing Rory pick Amazon reminds me that I almost picked Apple because I kind of had the same mindset. I wanted like a big, solid, traditional tech player, but I actually decided to instead go with Viva Systems,
Okay.
which is a SaaS company for the life science industry, and I like it because it's stable, it's consistent, it's very little competition. 19 out of 20 pharma companies use Viva's software, and they have a net retention over 100%, and they have a lot of growth left. They've only captured a 15% market share, and their total addressable market is estimated to be worth $13 billion. So they perform really well. They've got a long runway left to go. And yeah, I think it would be a nice little growth player to start off your portfolio.
one of my biggest holdings.
There you go. Thanks for that, guys. And that's it for today's show. So remember, if you have any questions you'd like us to answer, elevator pitches you'd like us to tackle, make sure to get in touch. You can find us on Twitter, that's at MyWallStreetHQ, on TikTok, that's at MyWallStreet, or simply just email us at pod@mywallstreet.com. If you're enjoying the show, make sure to tell your friends about us, and don't forget to leave a review for us on whatever platform you listen to us on. Spotify have actually just released a review or a rating feature on their iOS and Android apps. So if you listen to us on Spotify right now, make sure to jump in and give us 5 stars, please. And thanks everyone for joining us today, and we'll talk to you next week. See you then.